I'm MJ Daspit, and I'm here with co-presenter Neil Allen of Benchmark Maps to talk about our research to establish the location of Valley View Vineyard, one of the first commercial wine grape vineyards in Oregon. Valley View was established by Peter Britt, a pioneer photographer, horticulturalist, and musician who figured prominently in the early days of Jacksonville, a southern Oregon gold mining town that eventually became a hub of wine growing. The image here is the cover of a history of the Rogue Valley wine industry that I co-wrote with winemaker Eric Weisinger. It shows Peter Britt, who's right there, and he and his friends are enjoying a few bottles of wine in his garden, and as you can see, hats are involved. Peter Britt lived from 1819 to 1905. He was a Swiss immigrant who came to Southern Oregon around 1852. He was attracted by the lure of striking it rich at the gold diggings, but eventually made his fortune by supplying picks, shovels, levis, and other necessities to the miners. He was a mule skinner who brought goods in from Crescent City, California, for a couple of years, and then once the town of Jacksonville was up and running, and the gold fever had died down, he turned his attention to his lifelong interest in photography. He built a house on the hill where today's Britt Music Festival is held and opened a studio. He also brought in plants from all over the world to use in his ornamental garden. Some of those were grapevines. This is a picture of the Britt house that stood on a hilltop on the west side of Jacksonville from 1860 until 1960 when it was destroyed by fire. Notice the grapevines in the foreground. These are grapes. In his notebooks on grapes and wine production, Britt would refer to this small vineyard as the garden. Peter Britt did a brisk business in wine. He sold his product to buyers who brought their own pails and bottles for 50 cents a gallon. Famously, he ran afoul of the Internal Revenue for failure to procure a business license and pay taxes due on his earnings. In 1873, he received a letter notifying him for a fine for back taxes. That year, he got the required license and named his wine enterprise Valley View. By this time, Britt's harvest records indicate that he was growing grapes in two locations: the garden by the house and a larger planting known as the ranch or the farm. Britt's notebooks are extremely difficult to read, and even when he wrote decipherable accounts, mostly receipts for wine in pencil, the references to vineyard plantings are brief and vague. By this time, Britt's son Emil was also involved in his father's business enterprises. Here we see notes Emil made on varieties of grapes planted in the vineyards and the dates and sources of acquisition. Note the entry down here on Franc Pinot, which is dated 1887. Of interest, that entry is repeated on page 2 as Pinot Franc. Franc Pinot and Pinot Franc are early names for Pinot Noir, the grape that would become the signature varietal of Oregon's northern Willamette Valley. Some claim Emil's grape book as evidence that Britt was the first to plant Pinot Noir in Oregon. While it was clear where Britt's garden vineyard was, the location of the larger farm or ranch vineyard was never established. With the growth of the Southern Oregon wine industry, interest in that question has ramped up. Modern growers are keen to identify Britt as the uncontested father of the Oregon wine industry. As a historian of the Rogue Valley wine region where Britt's vineyards were located, I wanted to try and solve the puzzle. I'll just take a moment to point out Oregon's principal wine growing regions To the north, up around from anywhere from Eugene up through Portland, is the Willamette, a region known for Pinot Noir. To the south, the Rogue Valley, and its sub-appellation, the Applegate Valley. The southern region produces over 70 wine grape varieties, none of which has become the identity of the region. It has both cool pockets where grapes like Pinot Noir and Riesling do very well, and warmer areas suited to Bordeaux, such as Merlot, Cab Franc, and Sauvignon Blanc, and Rhone varieties such as Syrah, Grenache, and Viognier. So the question became, how would I go about figuring out where the 15-acre vineyard Britt's ranch was? Contemporary accounts, including newspaper references and an agricultural report commissioned by the state of Oregon in 1899, put it half a mile to the north of Jacksonville, where other growers had their vineyards as well. I also knew from reading Britt's harvest records that the first year he noted a harvest from his larger vineyard, the farm, or the ranch, was 1872. That meant the property where the larger vineyard was located had to have been acquired prior to 1872. I read everything Britt related I could, including the only substantial Britt biography in print, a 1972 master's thesis by Alan C. Miller. What I learned was that Britt had been quite a land baron. Here is an 1871 map of Jacksonville where Britt lived. Here's the same map, shaded to show properties deeded to Britt. This image isolates the lot where Britt's house was located, which is in this area, on the hill where today's Britt Music Festival is held. But Britt also owned properties outside of Jacksonville proper, in fact, all over Southern Oregon. In an appendix to his biography of Britt, Alan Miller included a listing of Britt's property deeds. I reasoned that if I could locate all the properties Britt owned, I'd eventually find the one property to the north of Jacksonville that had been acquired prior to 1872, which would have to have contained the vineyard. The Jackson County Recorder's Office not only retains historical deeds going back as far as the 1850s, but has digitized those documents and made them available online. I was able to print copies of a total of 47 Britt deeds and then set about transcribing the legal property descriptions on each one. Through this process, I was able to find a property that fit for time, acquired prior to 1872, and general area north of town. This is the deed to that property made between David L. Hopkins and Peter Britt. And it's dated 28 April 1871. This is the legal description enlarged so you can read it. Good luck if you're not practiced with that early handwriting. But what it says is the southeast quarter of the northwest quarter, the fractional northeast quarter of the southwest quarter, and the fractional northwest quarter of the southeast quarter of Section 20 in Township 37 South, Range 2 West, containing 110.52 acres. And if you take the time to actually read through this, you can also see that the price of that 110 acres was $1,000. Given that, I wasn't much the wiser as to where that property actually was located, so I had to find a cartographer to make me a map. Benchmark's Neil Allen agreed to take on the task of plotting the Britt properties.
So yes, MJ came through my door and brought me all these cryptic descriptions, but it was something that I was aware of back from mapping school district boundaries back in Kansas years ago. So she at least graciously went through and distilled them into just kind of their core components so I could just focus on what the geography was. And so she, as we went through and read these, and I mapped all 47 properties, some of which were very intricate and detailed, as you can see, and somewhat confusing. We narrowed in on what we were looking for, which was, or what we thought was, which was deed 42, and you'll see how we get into that. So part of it was getting back to my roots, or the kind of the roots of cartography, and learning about the historical tools. And you can see here that we've got a set of chains and transit and the notebook. However, I did have some difficulty with a few of them, and I think it may have to do with the fourth tool that many surveyors used quite often than not, which was drinking. So I went through and from our local county, who provides all sorts of GIS data, she provided the historical documents and descriptions. I went through and got all the tax lot boundaries and the township and range boundaries and so on and so forth through streams. And I went about bringing these into an Illustrator file and laid out all the assets that I have there, and then just using 1 to 1200 as a scale to make my conversions much easier and quicker on the fly. I could make the conversions, and I really wasn't too concerned with scale, or not scale, with projection, because it was just so localized that it wasn't that big of a deal for these. Well, one thing I did run across, we went through and we found a lot of old historical surveys that had come out of these books, and it was just out of the historical documents. And I thought these might be useful, and they proved not to be ultimately. They weren't as useful, but I'm just going to zoom in and just look at just kind of how these guys would set out in the field and survey, and just some of the beautiful maps and hashing that they did for the time. I was taken by these and wish they could have been more useful, but they really weren't, unfortunately. So I ended up just bringing this document into an Illustrator file, and then overlaying the township and range and the tax lot boundaries on top of there, and they matched up really well. And so this was deed 42 as described, that we got in, and through her kind of historical recreation, we figured out that yes, these were the 3 lots that Britt owned that were about an hour outside of town by horse, and she'll get into that a little bit more. And then bringing in the air photography and whatnot, we wanted to see who owned that land currently. And so we narrowed it down to this, and we found all the tax information, and I brought that in for her so she could try to make contacts with these people to see if we could to get on their property. But I believe that's when I turn it back to you, MJ, and let me just double check. Yes, exactly. And so we ended up making this map, and I'll let her talk about it because there's some neighboring properties and so forth.
So Neil and I came to call this little orange outlined area affectionately Area 42. The 110 acres that Britt had acquired in 1871. And indeed, the property does lie north of Jacksonville, west of the old stage road between Tammy Lane and Old Military Road today. If you're ever in that area, you can easily drive out there and just look at it. By 1875, Britt had added another 480 contiguous acres, which we have shown in purple, to the original tract. To be extra certain of our claim that we had found the right property, we also validated it based on this letter of 1911 that Britt's son, Emile, wrote to his sister, Molly. And in this letter, Emile describes a brush fire that spread from the neighboring Reynolds property onto his ranch. Again, using property descriptions in deeds, I found one Reynolds property abutting Britt's post-1875 northeast property line, and that lent support to the conclusion that our Area 42 was indeed the original tract known as the ranch. Our findings in these maps were published in Southern Oregon Wine Scene, a magazine devoted to the wine industry of the Rogue Valley. And just to sort of round out the picture, this is a photograph of Valley View Vineyard taken around 1880. And note that hillside, which is always a prime area for grapes. And here, we have the same hillside, as near as we can tell. We think that looks pretty similar. So I'm satisfied that this appears to be the same property based on everything we can put together. Thank you. That's all we have.